Hey there, everyone, and welcome back again to another episode of Live with Lindsay. And this week we're going to be talking about the role of unconscious bias in workplace interactions, with really the goal of making a more inclusive workplace. And we've spoken about this before. I think those who follow me know that inclusion is something that's very important to me, one of my core values. And so I'm really excited this week to be able to introduce you to Tina Varughese, who's a professional speaker and trainer whose expertise is all about unconscious bias, cross-cultural communication, and inclusion and diversity. So I got kicked out, but here I am. Um, Let me just check that I'm still live. I think so. Okay, yeah. So here I am. I'm back. So I was just about to give you a quick intro to Tina and her expertise. So named one of Canada's 10 notable speakers by Ignite magazine, audiences describe Tina as dynamic, highly energetic, relevant, and hilarious. And I would say that I've seen a bit of that in watching her speak also. She breaks down barriers to create a comfortable, inclusive, and fun space, leaving attendees inspired to think, behave, act, or communicate with intention. Her work has been featured on TSN, the Toronto Star, CBC Eyeopener, and Alberta Venture Magazine. Tino is an Indo-Canadian daughter of first-generation East Indian parents, which allows her to find the best of both worlds and shed light, knowledge, and most importantly, universal humor into the intercultural workplace, focusing on diversity and inclusion. So with that, I'm going to bring Tina in, and hello there.
Hello, Lindsay.
How are you?
I haven't.
Oh!
I haven't had coffee yet. Otherwise, I'm awesome.
Yes, well, as I was explaining to you, I've had one of those days our roof is leaking and hence me pressing all sorts of buttons and disappearing and coming back. But I'm here with you now. So I will leave the roof for an hour.
Oh, dear.
So yeah, thanks so much. As I was saying earlier, inclusion is something that is one of my core values, but I think I didn't even realize it until actually it was people on LinkedIn who started pointing it out to me that in my posts that I would often speak of inclusion. And so I'm really excited to get a chance to learn from you, of course, today. And so I guess one of the things I'd like to start off by is just having you define what unconscious bias is so we can all make sure we understand what we're talking about today.
Well, everybody has unconscious biases. Even if we don't think we have them, we do. We're not born with bias. However, with the company that we keep, the organizations that we work with, the social media that we look at, the news that we read, we are definitely all having unconscious biases. So very unintentional thoughts about others. And having those biases, we're not born with bias, and having unconscious biases truly doesn't make us racist or discriminatory. It just means that we're human. I think the key is to manage and mitigate those biases that we may have and become aware of the potential biases that we may have within us. But at the end of the day, we all have bias, including myself.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to real quickly say, to anyone watching, I'd love it if you would share that you're here with us, where you're watching from, and we're getting some feedback, it sounds like. Can you hear okay?
I can.
Okay, then I'll just ignore it. And if you're getting feedback, if you can let me know in the chat, and we'll try to figure that out. But yeah, so anybody listening, I'd love to hear where you're here from. Tina, you mentioned that it's unconscious bias is really those unintentional thoughts. And I like the way you define that, because that's really how I experience, right? I have these thoughts that come up and I think, where did that come from? Like, that's not consistent with who I am as a person. And yet there it is in my head.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the fact even that you're like, ooh, there it is in my head, that's not who I am as a person, is farther along than most. I think, unfortunately, most people aren't even aware that they have unconscious biases. And where that can get really dangerous is how we make decisions, if that be professionally or personally. We make decisions based on how our brains work and the neuroscience of our brains. The neuroscience of our brains creates shortcuts so that we ultimately make decisions that make us feel safe. But the question becomes, are we making the right decisions? And so that's why even the fact that you're pausing in that moment is key, because at least you're sort of questioning, why are you even having that thought in the first place? But most people, quite frankly, don't even do that.
Well, and I think, so I say I pause. I'm sure there's lots of instances where I don't realize too, right? And I think certainly with, George Floyd's death, and not that this has not been an issue that's been, going on for ever. But I think the more recent uprising of Black Lives Matter obviously has brought it to the forefront of my attention, like many, I think, and that has helped. But I'm sure there are still lots of instances where I am making decisions without unknowingly realizing it. I guess that's part of what I want to talk to you about today. Before I do so, I just want to say hi to a few people watching. So we have Mario here from Charlotte, North Carolina. Kimberly's here watching from Montreal. We do have an echo in the transmission. All right, so let me see. Let me know if that's any better, Mario, if you don't mind, because that's really annoying to listen to. So I have had problems with StreamYard before, but let me know if that's fixed. I don't hear it on my end. And we have Lily here from Guelph with us also. So I'd really like to talk about, when we're looking at, like you said, being aware of these unconscious biases. How do you become more aware of them? Because they're unconscious, right? So it's so hard to know they're there, because you don't necessarily notice the thoughts.
Right. So one great resource is if you were to Google Project Implicit. So Project Implicit is sort of the leading authority on unconscious bias testing, and they've been around for years upon years. And if you really are feeling like you want to do a bit of self-discovery and really uncover where your own unconscious biases lie, you can do the testing is free. You can go right directly to their website. There will be about 30 different tests. They take about 10 to 15 minutes each, depending on how quick you are. And it'll give you an assessment so that you can actually have a full understanding of where your own biases lie. It can be a very vulnerable moment for you, like any self-discovery. When we know better, we do better. But the only way we can do better is if we know better about ourselves. And I think it's so important for to understand our own lens. And if we don't really know how we're perceiving the world or seeing the world, we cannot move forward in this world. So it can be a vulnerable piece, definitely, but I'm a big believer of self-discovery. And so I think that would be step one. And just doing, I think especially with Black Lives Matters, people were inundated with books and resource, and no one really knew where to turn. But I think this is a really good step, because it's, it'll take you a couple of hours of your time, but at least it'll give you insights into who you are and how you're seeing the world around you.
I love that. I didn't realize there was a tool. Well, wait, so when I say that, I think you actually mentioned this during the CAPS convention I saw you spoke at. And then in the overwhelm of information I was exposed to in those 3 days, I think it then slipped my mind. So I'm going to stick this up here so I don't have the website with me right here, but Project Implicit, I'm going to definitely go check that out after, because
honestly, if you just Google Project Implicit, the testing will be the first thing that comes up. That's what they're known for. Definitely the leading authority on this. So it's a great place to start, just to uncover your own biases and to do that work. And I think it's great because it's not going to take you a lot of time, but it'll give you amazing insight. And you may be surprised where you have biases. You may go in with the assumption that you don't have any and go, oh dear, maybe I do have biases. I didn't know that. And that's not a bad thing. I think it's actually an empowering thing to self-discover. So that would be a great first step for most of your listeners on the line.
Oh, I love that. And I think in some ways too, the more we realize the biases we have, the more we realize how many we have, right? Because there's so many social constructs we've been raised, to believe that often you don't even realize that you have these views until, I guess, like you're saying, we use one of these tools to confront ourselves with them. And I think that's a big step that takes a lot of courage. I'd love to hear from people listening, if you've ever tried anything, if you've used any tool like this, if you have any other tools to share with everybody listening, I'd love for you to throw that into the chat. Kimberly here is saying that she finds this is where meditation helps because it helps us cultivate the awareness to notice our thoughts and we can see the judgment. So what are your thoughts on that, Tina?
So I am the worst meditator on the planet. I had to be taught how to meditate. Like I am literally squirrel.
Like everyone though.
I really did. And so I did notice though, I was taught how to do a 1-minute meditation and yeah, I mean, it really does sort of, center you. I do sleep meditation. I'm also a big journaler. And so I just find journaling, my thoughts can be very cathartic and give me so much insight. And, what irritates us the most gives us the greatest understanding of ourselves. And so even asking, why am I irritated right now? Why am I frustrated? So, just doing that deep dive work, if it be through meditation or self-reflection, gratitude, journaling, I think is so important for really understanding how are we seeing the world. It also gives us that emotional intelligence piece, which is so important. I think EQ is as important, if not more important than IQ. And I think that's so important to see, how we relate to other people. And I think we can get some of that information through that meditation or journaling, because we don't stop, right? We're in this world of the busy Olympics. And so we just don't really pause for thought. And we're very uncomfortable with silence. Part of the Canadian construct is to fill the void, fill the space. And I just think pausing for thought sometimes can give us great understanding of how we're thinking, how we're feeling, what our intentions are. And I don't think we do enough of that.
Yeah, I feel like we're often so caught up in making decisions and doing that we don't take that time to reflect on, what's driving those decisions, and are those decisions that are just kind of pre-programmed that we are doing because that's what's expected, and that's our programming, I guess, versus is that how we want to be approaching the world, I guess. And to bring it back into, sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's so true. I hear, I would do a lot of work with leaders, leadership training, and, they're exhausted in the sense that they're always putting out fires, putting out fires rather than dialing it back and kind of going, okay, how do we need to now empower the people? Because leaders should create more leaders. And so we really have to start figuring out how we can create more leaders, and at home and at work. How do we start to create more leaders from within? Because that, otherwise we're just constantly enabling behavior and putting out fires, and we're exhausted by it, and we're really not moving forward.
I agree with you fully. Yeah. So I'm curious to hear from you, sort of how you got into the line of work of, being specialized in unconscious bias.
Yeah, that was a bit of an interesting path. So I actually, I was born and raised in Canada, but my parents came from India. So I definitely had a lot of, maybe microaggressions that I didn't even realize I was being subjected to microaggressions. So those are unintentional acts of racism, ableism, ageism. And, one I had all the time, all my life is where are you from? No, where are you really from? So that was sort of a typical microaggression that I still live with. My professional background is I actually used to manage our immigration office for the province of Alberta. Once I left the government, I had a relocation and settlement company with oil and gas expatriates coming from out of country. And it was during that time that I really realized what it meant to be Canadian. It was such a privilege to be born here, because I was working with people that were choosing to be here, and they were moving here because of, if it be, political asylum, or if it be to have more space, if it be to have a better education for their kids. And these are all just things that I took for granted. But I was working in that space for such a long time. And in that space, I realized there was a huge gap, because in Canada, we have a 20% foreign-born population, and that demographic is only rising. In urban centers, you know, in Toronto, it's 39%, Vancouver's 45%. Like, that's a high foreign.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's really high foreign-born demographic, particularly in urban centers. And what I was hearing from my clients and the people that I was working with, you know, these oil and gas expats, they were talking about their perceptions of Canadians. And I found myself reeling back going, that's not what that person meant. That's not what that person meant. And I realized there was just so much to learn from one another. And with that gap, I realized I could potentially fill the gap a little bit, because I had worked so much with immigrants and new Canadians. And I realized there was so much misunderstanding and miscommunication. And so that's where I initially got into, you know, this field. And I got into the profession of public speaking because I actually was asked when I worked with the government, you know, they said, can you do a training session? And I'm like, I haven't trained anybody out of a paper bag. Like, why do you want me to do this? And they said, well, you seem outgoing and we can't afford to
Right. Like to talk.
Yeah, you can talk and you seem outgoing and we can't afford a trainer. Can you do it? So
that's how I got into it too.
And so I did it, and I realized I actually preferred to be at the front of the room versus sitting. And I had managed to do a lot of the things that speakers and trainers do naturally. I customized the content, I added some humor, I made it much more customized to the client, and I kind of did all these things naturally. But more importantly, I realized a little spark was ignited that I didn't even realize I had. And that's when I got into the profession of professional speaking. I literally had that golden handcuff around my wrist in terms of I was, you know, a senior leader in government and had the pension and the whole bit. And I was like, okay, you know, do I leave at this point? Because that can be pretty tough for people to start out on their own. But yeah, I think 13 years ago, I started out as a professional speaker and really haven't looked back. It was a good entrepreneurship journey for me. And being able to find that niche when I realized that it wasn't, you know, a hobby or even about profit, it really became about purpose, was when I realized I am a conduit to other people's stories. I really bring in other people's stories so that they're heard, seen, and acknowledged, which we all should be. And because I, you know, tend to be sort of a benign, relatable individual, I realize, and humorous, quite frankly, I use a lot of humor in my talks, and I realized I could build a lot of bridges versus building walls with that piece, and to take that perspective. So not just my personal perspective, but the perspective of others, and be a conduit to understanding. And so that was, I realized it was just purposeful at that point. I will admit, during Black Lives Matters, I was exhausted, Lindsay. Yeah, it was an exhausting time. Being a person of color, coupled with what I speak on, I just felt I had to be so verbal and educate.
And like under the microscope, probably too.
So under the microscope at that time. And it was, I didn't even realize how emotionally exhausted I was, but I still felt I had to use the privilege that I had of the platform, and my platform being a sphere of influence. And so I really felt I had to speak during that time. So I will say, even my own business, speaking business, has revved up during that time too, because people want to learn, they want to be better, they want to understand this topic, and they just don't know how to proceed. It's a bit of a space where we've gotten where we're, you know, walking on eggshells a little bit, and that's the last thing we want. We really want to have those courageous conversations where we are truly comfortable with being very uncomfortable.
So I'm going to get back to that in a second. I just want to go into the comments here for a few moments. So Martin Buckland here is saying, very admirable decision to leave a government job.
Yeah, I know.
Indeed. Yeah, but I love what you're saying, right, about how it was your passion and your purpose that fueled you to keep doing that because of the change you're making in the world. And I think we're at a point where there's starting to be more shift. Like I said, this has obviously been change needed in the world for a very long time. I mean, you said you started in this 13 years ago, when I don't even know if I had heard the word unconscious bias until maybe 2 years ago would be my guess. And I'm kind of in a related field, you know? And so for you to have started this so long ago to get to this point now where things are just starting to move and shift. I feel like there's going to be a lot of change in.
Well, I started actually on the cultural diversity side. So I definitely spoke on cross-cultural communication, cultural differences, cultural diversity. My signature keynote was 50 Shades of Beige. Communicate with the cross-cultural advantage. It's still a popular keynote. But like anything, I had to adapt too. And I just felt under that diversity and inclusion umbrella, then I started speaking on unconscious biases as well. And I find the topic super fascinating. Part of it is the fascinating too is the science behind it. And so, I, you know, Lindsay, and I'm sure you feel the same way, like we're speakers. I could have spoke, if you're a good speaker, if you have great content and delivery, you could speak on any topic, but this was the topic. It was not an easy topic, but I chose it because, or maybe it chose me. Maybe it chose me. Like I just felt I had to move forward in it.
But I think it takes a lot of courage to be bringing these topics forward that are, like you said, super uncomfortable. They're not necessarily topics that people always want to engage in, and to be willing to kind of be one of the people leading that movement. You know, I look at, you know, my journey in inclusion becoming really important to me came more from working in the world of disability, and then having my own 2 children with disabilities, but seeing how I was treated differently because of my education and because I'm white, and because, you know, although my kids have disabilities, there was definitely some challenges we lived in relation to how we were treated with that, but I could still see that we were treated better than some. And then I worked with First Nations organizations quite a bit, and always felt this, I don't know, you know, like why am I getting this because of the family I was born into? And I'm very grateful for that, but it just doesn't feel right, you know. And I'm not saying I haven't contributed to the inequalities, because absolutely inadvertently I think I have. But, you know, moving forward for my kids, you know, I don't want them to live in a world where there are those huge gaps in what people have access and opportunity to. You know, I was speaking to somebody yesterday just about how the criteria to get a job now have shifted so much from her grandfather's generation. And we were talking about how it's such a position of privilege to be able to access that, and how that perpetuates inequalities, you know? So yeah, I just love that you're
and I think you touched on it, right? I think those, when you said, you know, you were feeling like, well, why is this? And that's privilege right there.
Absolutely.
Privilege isn't about what you have. It's more about what you haven't experienced. And that's more the piece of privilege, because people often get that really mixed up. They think, well, I'm not privileged. You know, I had a really difficult life.
Right. So you're frozen, so I'm just going to interject here. I don't know if you'll hear me, but there's like relative privilege, right? So privilege doesn't necessarily, I don't know if...
like
She'll be back in a sec. Or I don't know if I'm the one who's frozen.
I see me.
So we'll just hang on a sec. I think what I'll do while I'm just waiting for Tina. Oh, there she is. You hear me?
You the whole time.
You could hear me the whole time?
Yes.
As I was talking over you? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, I couldn't, yeah. Yeah, because you said, oh, we just Tina, and literally I'm like, still.
You're the one frozen. So Mark is saying Mark is our tech expert here. The hardest thing in tech is always AV, isn't it? You test it all out. It's working all awesome.
Yes.
1 minute to showtime, crashes.
I know. My experience. I know. And I am no help to you. Mark will have to help you. I am no help to you.
Me either. I call my husband. I'm like, help. I do my minimum that I can muddle through. I call him for help. I don't know. My network here is looking good, but anyhow, we'll see. We'll sit here for a minute. Maybe I'll just get you. I don't know if you're talking. I don't know who can hear who. I'll go through the comments while we're waiting. How about? So Kimberly here is saying that she's inspired by your courage. And Mark felt that was a great insight you shared about being a conduit to other people's stories, and that we're wired for story. I do want to go back up. So earlier, Kimberly had said, just in relation to her discussion about meditation, she'd said, many people feel they don't meditate well in the beginning. It's normal. Tons of thoughts are normal. We need thoughts to be able to cultivate the gap between the thoughts, which is where we find clarity. It's like gravity for pull-ups. Just keep practicing noticing the thoughts. It gets easier. So thank you for that advice, Kimberly. So I don't remember where we were in our discussion before we started disconnecting, or if we're even connected right now. I'll just wait a sec.
Oh.
Hello.
Hear me?
I do right now. Maybe, hang on a second. I have no idea if this will do anything. I'm just going to take you in and out of the broadcast, and I have no clue if that's going to change anything, but let's try. Mark, you can tell me that this is a total waste of time. I don't know. Did that do anything?
I don't know.
I hear you.
I hear you.
Oh, well, look at that. I fixed it. All right. So you had been talking about uncomfortable conversations when we started losing track, I think. All right. So Mark is saying it may help. So I'm just going to take us both out of the broadcast for a second and bring us both back in. Let's cross our fingers. How's that? Do you want to? Martin says technology makes him feel uncomfortable. I'm with you there. Makes me feel way more uncomfortable than talking about unconscious bias. Well, so I guess on that note, if I don't know who can hear, I don't know if you can hear me or you can hear Tina. So I suppose maybe that's a note that it is time to wrap up. No, you still see me, Tina.
I can see you. Can you
okay,
see
so let me ask this to everyone else. Can everyone else hear Tina? Because I can't. Okay, so they tell me I'm clear and Tina's frozen. The problem could be Tina's internet connection, Mark was saying. Although you just did a keynote. So, okay, I hear you now. So let's just pretend that didn't happen.
Okay.
Thanks for sticking by us, everyone, and sharing your technical expertise. I appreciate it.
So can you hear me, but you can't see me? Is that what we're saying? Because I'm actually.
I can do both. You're perfect now. You're clear as, yeah.
Yeah. Martin in the chat said technology makes him uncomfortable. I'm with Martin.
Me too. I married someone who works in IT at 18 and decided that was a sign that I didn't have to learn anything further. And here I am, you know, almost 15 years later, highly regretting just passing it off to him. So
yeah. Well, I got the Ethernet cord. I am wired in.
Okay,
that's it.
We're good. So everyone says we're good. All right, so let's get back at it. So you were talking about uncomfortable conversations. I'd love to talk a little bit about, you know, in the workplace, how somebody who's in a leadership position can start having these kinds of conversations that are needed around unconscious bias, because I've spoken with many people who have said that, you know, for instance, when they see hiring practices that are demonstrating bias, that when they speak up, it's not always well received. And so how can people have these conversations effectively? You have some tips?
Yeah, I really do feel it has to start with education and awareness and training first, company-wide. You know, the beauty of virtual work right now, like we all as speakers, Lindsay, you know, we were BC before COVID, we could do this live. And the thing with live events is often it was the, you know, leaders that were sent to these conferences and that it was expensive to send everybody. The beauty of virtual is, you know, I have a keynote coming up in December with 7,000 people on the line. So you can imagine, I find virtual keynoting and workshops is more inclusive. You can actually get everybody involved in that training across the board. So I really first feel it starts with education and awareness, because, you know, how can you say to someone, well, we're seeing some issues with your hiring practices, if you don't step back and go, well, wait a second, do you have unconscious biases? Yes, no, I don't even know what they are. You know, because I actually, when I'm doing a keynote, I will ask that question. Do you have unconscious biases? Yes, no, I don't know what they are. The majority will say I have them. I will definitely have at least 30% say, no, I don't have an unconscious bias. And I'll have many, many brave souls say, I don't even know what they are. So if you don't really know what they are, then you would never in a million years know that you're guilty of potentially, and I don't like to use the word guilty, but you know, you wouldn't know that you're potentially having unconscious biases when you're hiring other people if you didn't even know that they exist. So I think it truly starts with education, awareness, training. From there, and you had kind of mentioned you didn't know like what unconscious bias is, that terminology. I would say even diversity and inclusion initiatives were not even at the forefront in Canada till the last 3 to 4 years. You know, I would say DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives only came into the forefront in Canada in the last 3 to 4 years. Much more prevalent in the United States, mostly because of affirmative action. You know, you would see managers of diversity and inclusion with large organizations, but that came with affirmative action, which we don't have in Canada. And so that's definitely why part of that DEI initiative only came to the forefront in Canada in the last 3 to 4 years. A lot of firms really, I'm noticing uptake now. Part of that impetus was Black Lives Matters. Part of that drive is coming internally. People are like, okay, you know, what are we doing? What are we doing as a company? You know, what are we addressing? So now you're noticing people internally are demanding that a little bit. So, you know, starts off with education. I'm a big believer of putting committees together internally, you know, and making sure it's a cross section of people. It shouldn't just be your leadership. It should be management, non-management, you know, a very diverse perspective. A big believer of doing surveys of companies that certainly can be done anonymously, but where I've seen companies really lose a lot of cred is when they do this constant surveying of employees, and then they don't take action on any of those suggestions, or they don't even articulate what some of the suggestions were. So they get surveyed to death, and then they're like, I'm not going to continue doing this. It's like a child, you know, I'm not going to, if you're not going to like give me any positive reinforcement or let me know I've been heard, I'm not going to do anything here. So those are sort of key places that companies need to start, is the education, putting these committees together, town halls, questionnaires of their own employees. Use your own internal organizations. You know, there's so much diversity of thought, diversity of perspective internally, but we're not utilizing it to the best of our capacity. So definitely those are key places to start for organizations.
Yeah, I love that. And I think especially what resonated with me when you were talking there was when you were saying about the committees being cross-cultural or diverse, you know, because you know, in my work with First Nations clients, I came in not necessarily understanding the necessity of having the voice of someone Cree in the room when we were making decisions and setting out programming. And it took me listening to, you know, people who I consider to be mentors to me for quite a while until I became the voice saying, no, we can't do this without someone. But I came to realize that I can learn as much as I want about Cree culture and First Nation history, but I can never be their voice in the room because I'm not Cree, you know, and I see how they bring a whole different aspect to the discussion, and that I think that's something that's missing. I see a lot, the understanding of how important it is to have representative voices of the room, you know, where we often have decision-making teams that are really not at all representative of the workforce making decisions about the workforce. And of course, then people don't necessarily like the decisions that are made, and leads to all sorts of problems, obviously.
Well, exactly. And we're seeing it now even in pop culture. Why did the movie Crazy Rich Asians do so well? Why Never Have I Ever on Netflix? Why Kim's Convenience? Why are these atypical? Great show. So, and there was another one I loved too on Netflix. I can't remember what it was called. It was a documentary about autistic young adults in Australia.
I watched it. I can't remember what it's called, but
I can't remember either. I don't remember because I just love these shows. Yeah. And I think the key, why were these shows popular right now? Because they weren't heard before. They weren't represented before. People want to see themselves, being represented. And, that's why. But as you can see, mainstream, Crazy Rich Asians, Kim's Convenience, atypical, you don't have to be autistic or Korean to really appreciate these shows. We want to learn from one another through story. And I think, but if we're not represented, we're not in the play. We're not even being considered. My favorite quote on diversity is who's on the team. Inclusion is who gets to play. And that's sort of, you can have diversity, but you can't have inclusion. They have to go together, diversity and inclusion. But if you only have diversity without the inclusion, you have not moved forward.
Well, you're kind of just reinforcing the same problem in many ways, right? If you're allowed to sit at the table but not have a voice, then it's almost better to not even be invited in some ways. I'm not saying that's actually necessarily true because it's a step in the right direction, but I can imagine the experience of the person, would not be one where they're feeling terribly welcome. I'd love to just give a chance. So we're here for about 10 more minutes. Anyone who's watching, if you have any questions specifically for Tina, she's been, this is her area of expertise of long date. And I'd love for you to drop those in the comments. There's somebody here, so LinkedIn user, I don't know who it is. I think StreamYard blocks, for some reason, StreamYard blocks some accounts, but just saying thanks for a lovely conversation. Tina, I really loved your comment that it's about what you don't experience, not necessarily what you have experienced. Yes, couldn't agree more with that definition that you've given of inclusion. So thank you for that. One thing that I want to talk about while the questions are coming in is, with the Black Lives Matters movement that is not new, but certainly amplified through COVID, are you finding that the divisiveness, I don't even know how to pronounce it, you can correct me, has it gotten worse in the world, or do you find it's getting better? There's these diversity and inclusion movements, but where are the trends? Where do you see things going?
So Will Smith did a great quote on this. It's not that racism has decreased, it's just being taped now. So, I right? Like I just went, that is so true. And I don't even know how to respond to that question, because I found with Black Lives Matters that many more agents of change came out of Black Lives Matters, particularly, and this is where I was inspired beyond belief, was with Gen Z. Gen Z, our generation of hope, was one of the most vocal generations out there. And I was privileged to work with Hockey Canada during the pandemic. Hockey Canada, hockey, the most Canadian well-known sport, recognized, that there was racism on the ice, that there was unconscious bias, that there were microaggressions, that there was chirping, that was prevalent, and they wanted that addressed. So I was working with their staff and top, elite athletes. And I was worried because my audiences are usually corporate, definitely a Generation X, boomers. So I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be working with kids between the ages of 16 and 24 and their staff. How am I ever going to connect on this topic? And what I loved about them is they were more than willing to say, I didn't know that. And now that I know that, I'm going to do better. They had no issues being transparent about what they didn't know. And that was the group too that I noticed with Black Lives Matters, that were the protesting, that were verbal on Instagram, that had no issues taking a stance and being agents of change. So are we more divisive? I think we're more verbal. I think we're more vocal because of social media. I think we're potentially more I don't know if we're more divided. I think we're more vocal because we've been given this platform. But I also see positives. Like I've seen a lot of people doing the work, doing some hard work and reading, you know, the Skin We're In, and like all of these amazing books that are available, and guides, and wanting to talk about it and wanting to be agents of change. So I actually see positives now in a way that I haven't seen before. I will say I put a very controversial post up. And I just said, you know, and I do this sometimes on social media. Usually I'm pretty, you know, I try to keep it as benign as possible, educational as possible, but sometimes I'll make it pretty divisive. And I just went, you know, the minute the conversation dies down, so does another Black man. And that was sort of one of the posts that I had put up. And, you know, I think it's kind of went woo with people, but they were like, yeah, you're right. Like we just have to keep having the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was one of my realizations through George Floyd's death. Like being inclusive is very important to me, and yet I hadn't had the conversations with my kids. Like it's almost like I just assumed that because I try to model inclusivity that I don't know. Like when I say that, going through an explanation of it doesn't even make sense. But what it made me realize was, oh, I need to be having way more conversations with my kids about this than I am, because I just kind of assumed they would, you know, soak it up and like grow up to be inclusive. And when George Floyd had died, I paused and thought, you know, do I talk to my kids about this? My kids have tons of anxiety. And I thought, oh, you know, at their age. And then my friend who was brown said to me, well, I have to tell my kids about it. And that's when I thought, oh, that's my privilege, that I get to choose whether I tell my children or not, right? Like if I was a person of color, I'd be telling my kids. I would have had way more conversations with my kids. And that was my realization of, oh yeah, you got to be having these conversations with your children. So lots of learning, you know.
I know. I'm guilty of this. My kids are biracial. So I'm married to a big 6'5" white dude. And I'm like 5'2", and we kind of look like a semicolon together. But but my kid's a hockey player, and so of course when I started working with Hockey Canada, I'm like, well, you know, and being biracial, you know, sometimes like the skin color of my kids, you wouldn't necessarily know that they're of mixed race per se. My daughter looks almost like has the skin tone of a Sofia Vergara, you know, very Latin. I always call my son my little Bollywood star. He's very, very fair. But he, you know, if you put him up against a white kid, yeah, you'd be able to tell there's something, but you wouldn't know what. And so I just assumed, you know, that because they were lighter than mommy, that they weren't experiencing racism. And my kid just looked at me like I was nuts. And he's like, Mom, you know, I'm on the ice and people tell me to go back to India and go eat curry all the time. And I was blown away. I just went, what? Like you experience racism in 2020 and you didn't tell me? Your mom's a diversity and inclusion trainer. Are you kidding me? And he's like, well, why would I tell you? It's just part of my life. It's part of my story.
Right.
And that blew me away because I realized his story was different than mom's story, but it was still a story, a relevant story that I had been blind to because I assumed he wouldn't have the same stories as I did because he was lighter than me.
Right.
So I'm guilty of it too. So I think we really do have to be having those conversations. Doesn't matter, you know. And a great strategy to manage and mitigate bias, Lindsay, is it was by Kristen Presner. She's an HR consultant. Did a cool TED talk on it. Flip it to test it, and that's what you did with your brown friend, because your brown friend said, "I'm going to tell my kids." Flip it and test it. Okay, if she's telling her kids, should I be telling mine? That's the flip it and test it. And if it doesn't apply to all, then yeah, you're really not managing and mitigating your own bias. So you caught yourself in there by
yeah, lots of learning still, I'm sure, like as you know, as we continue to go through this. So I just want to go in 1 second. So just one last question here. So Martin is asking, how do you feel diversity in Canada compares to the US?
So let me give you
like, do you want to comment on that? On the day of the election?
Yeah, no doubt. Let me give you a great example of this. And is Martin based out of the States or the US? Do we know?
Canada.
Okay.
Well, does that change your answer?
No.
Just kidding.
But I'm going to give you what this is a perfect example. So I am a diversity and inclusion speaker. I speak in Canada and the US, mostly in Canada. I was contacted by a US firm. They point blank said, Tina, you know, we'd love to bring you in because we have on the job people of different races calling each other niggers. And yeah, I'm saying it out loud because we don't say the word. That this was on the job site internally. Can you come and help us with that? And I said, no. I will not be able to assist you in a 1-hour keynote or a half-day workshop or even a week and assist you with what's occurring internally on the job. It was I think it was a Fortune 500 company. Like, and I went, yeah, we're a little bit different than the States. Now, are we guilty of systemic racism in Canada as they are in the US? Of course we are. You know, systemic racism occurs in our healthcare systems. Ask any one of Black, Indigenous, people of color when they walk into a store. You know, are they being followed? Often. Is that in an employee manual written down? No. But is it part of the company policy? Yes. So are we that different? I call us polite racists in the sense.
I was just going to say, do we just hide it differently? You know, so when I was, and I know we have to wrap up here, but I might have told this story before, but not to you. So when I was probably in my early 20s taking a bus from Amsterdam to France, and they stopped us at the border to, you know, check. They were looking for drugs essentially, but they collected everyone's passports and then called off anybody who was of color. While I sat there, you know, they were taking off all these men in suits, and I sat there as a 21-year-old university student, completely left alone, and I was enraged, and I was mouthing off, and my husband kept looking at me saying, shut up, like this is not your fish to fry. And I was 21, so I did shut up. And but it was such blatant racism to me. So as a Canadian who's you know, not of color, that was my first exposure to like really blatantly clear racism. But then as I came home and kind of watched what was going on at home, the same kind of things were going on. We just weren't as open. You know, they probably would have checked us all, but they wouldn't have really checked me. They would have gone through the signs of checking me to make it seem like, you know, it was fair. And so you know, there's just differences somewhat, I think, in how much we try to hide it, perhaps. Yeah. I don't know if that's fair to say it that way.
I have in my keynote, I share a story of a gentleman who gave me permission to share a story. So he wears a turban, goes through Canadian airports all the time. And he said he's always checked 98% of the time. His colleague said, yeah, right. And sure enough, they went for a conference and he was pulled. And the colleague said, why him? And the airport security said, well, it's random. It can't be random 98% of the time.
No, it cannot be. Yeah.
So that's systemic racism in play in Canada. So yeah, it's apparent here too. I just think we close a blind eye to it sometimes. It's more convenient.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so Tina, I just want to ask you, so it's time to wrap up, but I have a really good question here in the comments. Do you have 2 more minutes to answer? Yeah, so, okay, thank you. So Edward is asking, how do we convince others that diversity is not only about race, but also age and health and other areas? And how do we convince people that diversity equals prosperity? And I think I just really wanted to bring this in because it's such a great question.
Okay, so when I talk about unconscious biases, I actually talk about the 7 key biases that we tend to have professionally and personally, which are gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, age, weight, and disability, both physical and emotional. With that being said, there are over 170 statistically discovered unconscious biases, but we tend to have biases in those areas of the key 7. Now, when I would do a poll and I'd ask, where do you feel discrimination is most prevalent in Canada? Most people will say race is number 1, gender is number 2, but those 7 key biases is prevalent for all. And that might change depending on what sector you're working in, depending on where you live,
your experience, right?
Your experiences, that's going to change. Where you totally are on point when you say, so diversity, it's not just the right thing to do, it's actually does equate to the more profitable thing to do. According to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, if you were to increase diversity minimally by 1% in an organization, it'll increase profitability minimally by 2.4%. Meaning, if you were making 10 million in revenues, you would minimally make 240,000 in profit. If we were to look at the McKinsey Institute, which is one of the leading authorities in diversity and inclusion, and stats to back that up, if you were to increase women in leadership roles, minimally, companies would outperform by 15%. If we were to look at bringing in more ethnic diversity into firms, companies would outperform minimally by 35%. So Edward, you're totally right that diversity, it's not just the right thing to do, it is the more profitable. And when I look at diversity, I don't look at it from a perspective of race or religion or who's gay, who's straight. I look at it as diversity of thought. At the end of the day, what are we bringing to the table as individuals that we can collectively now bring forward to make organizations more creative, more innovative, more prosperous? That's what we want to bring and harness to the table, is the diversity of thought and perspective.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you shared that list with us, because I think myself too, up until recent years, sort of viewed diversity through a race and a sexuality lens. Yeah. And it was really only as I went into my own business and I started getting involved. So I'm a member of an association called WEBE, Women in Business Enterprise, that works on supplier diversity and more inclusion of women in business. And I was floored to learn that 5% of corporate contracts are currently awarded to women in Canada. 5%. And just very naive. Like I hadn't necessarily felt a ton of oppression myself as a woman, or been aware of it, I should say. Maybe not felt it, but and so that wasn't even on my radar, right? And so, like you say, there's this whole gamut. And I guess at the end of the day, when we move towards more inclusion, we move towards extending that to everyone, you know? And so I guess perhaps on that note, we will wrap up. Martin is saying thank you for the statistics. Astounding statistics. So thank you. So I just wanted to thank everyone for taking time out of your day. I realized yesterday night, I thought, oh my gosh, it's the election. This is a bad time. Is anybody going to be able to pull themselves away? I haven't turned my TV on, but
I haven't yet either.
I thought, this might be a bad time to stream, but thank you for taking an hour out of watching the news to join us today and learn more about unconscious bias. And thank you, Tina, for sharing all your expertise with us.
My sincere pleasure, Lindsay. Keep up the good fight. You're doing an awesome job.
Thank you. And I just want to ask real quick, so where can people connect with you to learn more about the work that you do?
You visit my website. That would be the best place to go, which is tworksforyou.ca. So it's tworksforyu.ca.
Okay, so there you go. You can head on over to Tina's website, and I'm sure there must be something there you can subscribe to be able to stay in touch with Tina and get all sorts of info from her, so you can continue to work on your own unconscious bias in an ongoing fashion. So thanks again, Tina. And we will be back again in 2 weeks' time, Wednesday at 6 p.m. on, I don't know what that is. We're not coming next week, so whatever, in 2 weeks in Wednesday. Anyhow, watch LinkedIn. There'll be an announcement there. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.